Yeah, that was I have an interesting resume. That's the takeaway of this talk, is that I have an interesting and eclectic resume. First off, I want to take a moment to thank everybody who came here today. I recognize that all of you are really busy and all of you have 100 other things that you could be doing right now, but you chose to come here and spend an hour of your time with me, and I'm very grateful. I hope that that will be time well spent for you. This is my first brown bag talk. My introduction made it sound like I'm like an old pro at presenting research. But this is my very first brown bag talk, and it's my very first audience that's composed of a large percentage of faculty members. So I am kind of pretty nervous, but I'm going to do the best that I can. Thank you, you guys. As he mentioned, I am a graduate student right now. I am not a faculty member, but I am a graduate student in 2 departments. I am a graduate student pursuing an MA in anthropology, and I am also a graduate student in the philosophy department, and I'm pursuing my MA there with the hopes that I will eventually go on to get my PhD in philosophy. Probably. That's the direction that it looks like I'm headed in. But one of my primary interests is reconciling normative theories with empirical information. To that end, the question today is, can utilitarianism, which is a normative theory, still provide justification for our common sense moral beliefs, given what we empirically know about happiness? I do want to tell you guys that I have made a little departure from the tradition of the brown bag. When I was preparing this presentation, I had to make peace with a few aspects of myself, and one of those aspects is that I am just terrible at slides. It goes in one of 2 directions. Either I forget I have them because I'm so caught up in what it is I'm saying, and I'm standing here like, why is my audience giving me side eye and looking at me with this anticipation every time I make a new point? And then it's like, well, duh. Okay, I forgot to change the slide. Or I become obsessed with the slides, and I just focus so much on changing them that I just read to you, and I'm assuming you guys don't want story time during the brown bag talk, right? Maybe you do, but that's not what we're going to do. So my slides are very minimal, and I recognize that that's a departure from the tradition of the brown bag talk. Also, I move a lot, in part because I just have a lot of nervous energy. So if I'm moving around this room, I'm not crazy. Probably, I just have a lot of energy and I move. So you might have to put some, I'm going to make you work if you want to follow me as I'm talking. So I'm also to that point, I'm an interactive speaker. So I will talk to you and ask you questions a lot more than many of the brown bag speakers do. Okay, so I'm weird. Let's get the show on the road. I want to start with the trolley problem. The trolley problem is a classic moral dilemma in philosophy. Has anybody except for my crew seen the trolley problem before? Okay, May, you don't count. You're part of my crew. Okay, can somebody talk about what the trolley problem is? Sorry, I'm gonna source out my work wherever I can. So tell us about the trolley problem.
So the trolley problem, our version was the train tracks, but rather you are at a lever and there's a train going by, and apparently there's like people tied to the train tracks, and it's obvious that they're gonna die. But your choice, the choice that you have in the matter is pulling that lever and then switching that track off to another road which also has people tied to the train tracks. So it's apparent that either side, someone's gonna die. It's just that who do you choose and how do you justify which choice you choose? And
yeah,
go ahead.
That was just about perfect. You did a great job. Yeah, that's a really good synopsis of the trolley problem. The idea is, we have a trolley. The trolley is out of control. And if you do nothing, the trolley is going to hit these 5 very unfortunate looking individuals that are tied up down there. But, fortunately, you can take action. You are also the very unfortunate looking person standing at the lever. If you pull the lever, you divert the trolley down that side track. You will kill 1 individual, but you'll save a net 4 lives. What do you guys think? Is it permissible to pull the lever?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Can you just raise your hand, you guys? Okay. Awesome. Why do you guys think it's permissible to pull the lever? Not you guys, not my crew. Why do you guys think it's permissible? Yeah.
Because you're saving a net 4 lives by
Awesome.
doing that.
Awesome. That seems so obvious. I want to put a pin in it. I want you to keep your answers to the trolley problem in the back of your mind as we go forward. Because I want to take a moment before we get into the meat of the presentation to make an important distinction. I would like to distinguish between descriptive claims and normative claims. A descriptive claim is a claim about what the world is like. And it's confirmed or disconfirmed by observations about the world. Normative claims, in contrast, are claims about how the world should be, what we ought to do, good or bad or right or wrong. And they're not necessarily confirmed by looking at how the world is. I want you to bear that in mind because utilitarianism is a normative theory. A lot of people can sometimes reject normative theories out of hand by just producing examples of when we don't reason that way. That doesn't work though, because it's not intended to be a claim about how people actually reason or how people actually evaluate the moral permissibility of their own actions. So just keep that in mind going forward. But still, being able to make sense of our ordinary moral convictions is a good feature of a normative theory. Okay. See, I told you I didn't have a lot of slides. That's all of the slides that I have. Okay. Everybody good on descriptive versus normative? Awesome. I will take silence to indicate yes on this very quiet afternoon. Okay. So, on to consequentialism and utilitarianism. In the grand scheme of things, utilitarianism is a species of a broader normative view that's called consequentialism. So if it helps you, think of consequentialism as the genus, utilitarianism as the species. Consequentialism holds that an action is right or wrong based solely on consideration of its consequences. And a right action to the consequentialist is the action that promotes the most good. Utilitarians are interested in a specific kind of consequence, namely the promotion of happiness. A right action, according to utilitarians, is the action that promotes the most happiness for the individuals affected by that action. There are other subspecies of the normative theory. You can be an act or a rule utilitarian. You can be a maximizing or a satisficing utilitarian. But that's kind of the general breakdown, the big picture view. Did somebody have a question?
No.
Oh, okay. I thought you were asking something. Sorry. And one of the good things is that consequentialism, and by extension utilitarianism, has a lot of intuitive appeal. One thing, it seems intuitively true to us that the consequences an action has is important for evaluating its moral permissibility. Example, the trolley case. When I asked you guys to raise your hand and indicate whether you thought it was permissible to pull the lever, a good portion of you raised your hand and said that it was permissible. And when I asked you why it was permissible, the reason is, well, you save a net 4 lives, right? The consequences of pulling the lever in the trolley case is what seems to make it permissible to do so, at least for those of you that feel that it's morally permissible to take that course of action. Also, happiness and well-being seem intuitively worth pursuing. They seem like intrinsically good things that make sense to want and that make sense to go after. Moreover, utilitarianism does a good job of explaining common sense moral intuitions, at least some dimensions of common sense moral intuitions or moral beliefs. For example, generally speaking, we think that lying is morally wrong. It's morally wrong to lie, but we're willing to grant that it's permissible if the lie is told to spare someone's feelings. Utilitarianism can tell a story that endorses this course of action, right? We can make sense of it. We can say, well, usually when people lie, it ends up hurting someone. It's used to take advantage of people. People can be exploited if you're dishonest to them. But there are also a lot of instances where telling the lie promotes the most amount of good. For example, when we're attempting to preserve somebody's feelings. Promise breaking is another good example. We think it's wrong to break promises, but we're willing to forgive people if they break promises to prevent something worse from happening. If I promised I was going to help you study and I didn't show up, we would think that I'm morally blameworthy for doing that, generally speaking. But if I didn't show up because I had to take my friend to the emergency room, that seems more forgivable because it seems like the stakes are much higher when I have to take my friend to the emergency room than if I don't help you study. Cruelty, we think random cruelty is also morally wrong. If I walk past you and I shout the nastiest thing that I can think of, that would be a morally bad thing to do. And the reason why utilitarians can say is that it's a morally bad thing to do, just because it really does not promote the greatest amount of happiness. So what is necessary for the story to work is that our moral actions or our lack of moral actions really contribute to the aggregate happiness in a meaningful way. But I think this gets utilitarianism into a bit of a problem when we look at the psychological research into happiness. So one of the things that we've learned through the research is that happiness across the lifespan is generally stable. It's a stable sort of dispositional trait. And happiness will rise or it will fall in response to daily life events, but it will regress to baseline. So the idea is that we have a happiness set point, that our happiness will always tend to return to. So that means whether I lie to you, or whether I break my promise to you, or whether I say something really nasty to you in the hall, it might have a really temporary effect on your happiness, but it's just unlikely that in the grand scheme of things, it's really going to matter much. And this shifts the frame of reference. One thing that you can say in reply to this example or to this problem is just that, well, it shifts the frame of reference, so instead of being concerned about your happiness in the long term, really what we need to do is we need to maximize immediate happiness. I think that would be problematic because I think if we emphasize maximizing the immediate happiness, it would end up sanctioning actions where the negative consequences are distal to the action being performed. For example, John is considering cheating on his wife. The negative consequences of cheating on his wife would come later on down the road if she found out, or somebody told on him. So those would come further down the road. In the immediate sense, it appears like cheating on his wife would maximize happiness, at least for the time being. And if we want to morally sanction those kinds of events, I think that's counterintuitive. Does that make sense? Because what we're attempting to do is we're attempting to preserve common sense intuitions. And sanctioning these kinds of counterintuitive things, I think, ultimately undermines the overall goal. Another problem is that it just has very weird implications for what kinds of acts are right or wrong. One of the things that the research has found is that layoffs, periods of sustained or prolonged unemployment, can have a permanent effect, or at least a lasting effect, on your happiness set point. So if you are fired or laid off and you don't have work for some period of time, it can actually downshift your level of happiness. If we are considering morality to just entail whether or not it promotes happiness or diminishes happiness, then
Sorry, Debbie, let me turn it off.
it's okay. It's okay. Whether or not,
Actually, I'm not really sure how to turn it off. This is like,
it's okay. I'm gonna drink water. You just turn it
what does
off.
this happen during a talk?
Nice beats.
It happens. I do. I thought it. Hey, I thought it was really danceable. I thought it was awesome. Okay. If our standard is just whether or not it promotes or diminishes happiness, it seems like laying somebody off or letting somebody go from their position is morally worse than breaking a promise to them or telling them a malicious lie or saying something cruel, because the effects, the consequences on your happiness of being laid off are far worse, far more long-lasting, and far more dramatic in this case than in the case where I am lying to you or breaking a promise or saying something cruel. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Again, I'm interpreting silence as awesome. Silence is the thumbs up. Okay. And on the other side of the coin, research has revealed that one of the things that can unambiguously increase your happiness set point, an upshift, is something like plastic surgery. Yeah, that's funny. It's okay. It's weird. It's a weird idea that one thing that can make us permanently more happy is just getting a nose job. That's an odd idea. But once again, it seems to imply that if we're just considering the consequences on net happiness, something that permanently upshifts happiness seems to have more moral value than the kinds of moral acts that we think are so important. Telling the truth, being fair, keeping our promises, things like that. And that seems to be a very odd kind of implication. There's a reply to this too, I think. You can say, well, in the case of layoffs, layoffs aren't done to maximize happiness. Layoffs are really done, and people are fired to prevent worse consequences. So for example, if a company is losing money in order to stay afloat, they might need to cut back on their workforce and let a few people go. And in those cases, we would say it prevents the worst thing from happening by letting people go. The problem is that that's not always the case. There are also cases where people are let go simply to streamline efficiency and increase the profit margins of already profitable companies. But even in those instances, we think it's morally permissible to downsize your workforce. It seems odd to say that's not the case. In the case of plastic surgery, we might say plastic surgery is bad for other kinds of reasons, or at least its moral worth is diminished for other sorts of reasons. We might say that plastic surgery is connected to vanity, and vanity as a whole produces bad consequences, or maybe it increases narcissism while also making you happy. It's just not clear that that's true, though, that any of these claims are true. But it is a potential reply you could make to this objection. And finally, I think that it suggests that some dimensions of our personality that we have very little control over actually have moral value. So for example, neuroticism, which is one of the big 5 personality traits, is correlated with downshifts in happiness set point. Conversely, extroversion is correlated with upshifts. Openness, for maybe obvious reasons, can be associated with both. And these traits can also somewhat predict or mitigate immediate responses to adverse effects. So people who are high in narcissism oftentimes experience more dramatic dips in their happiness after an event occurs. And we want to say then, if utilitarianism is true, that it appears like these traits, these dimensions of personality, some of which have strong heritable components, and that are largely outside of our hands, seem to have some sort of moral value or relation to our moral character. And that also just seems weird. It seems just weird to say that. And I think that a good response, or a response, is to say, so what? We think empathy, which is a psychological characteristic, also has moral value. And I think that doesn't work because I think that the reply to that is that empathy has moral value. We think it's a good virtue or a good character trait because it leads us to do moral things. On the other hand, the traits that are associated with our happiness, neuroticism, extroversion, and openness, they seem to have more to do with how we passively respond to things that happen to us, as opposed to leading us to do things that we would consider the right things to do. So this creates a little bit of a problem for utilitarianism, but I think it's not necessarily a problem that's beyond salvation. I think that utilitarianism can be salvaged. The first way that the first strategy that we could use to try to salvage utilitarianism, or at least salvage utilitarianism's ability to justify our common sense moral intuitions, is just to make a definitional objection. Just to say, well, what utilitarians are talking about, what they mean when they say happiness, is different from what psychologists mean and what they're measuring when they conduct these studies. The official measure is called subjective well-being. The problem is that subjective well-being, another member of my crew just walked in, sorry. Subjective well-being includes things like positive and negative affect, your subjective assessment of how good your life is going, fulfillment. So if these things are not what utilitarians mean when they say that they are interested in promoting happiness, it's just not clear what they're talking about. It's not clear what a definition of happiness would look like that doesn't include these kinds of things. It seems like it would have to touch upon them. Also, happiness, as utilitarians define it, is generally consistent with the description I've given of subjective well-being. So I don't think a definitional objection would work. A second strategy is just to bite the bullet. Dun dun dun, I'm gonna drink water. I talk a lot, but I don't normally talk this loud, so my mouth keeps getting dry. So a second strategy is just to bite the bullet and say, okay, well, it appears like utilitarianism isn't capable of justifying many of our common sense moral intuitions. So what? I think that's a problem, because when you think about it, it seems to me more likely that utilitarianism would be false than that many of our common everyday moral beliefs would just be completely mistaken or off base. So while I think that would work for some people who are comfortable saying that our common or our everyday intuitions are off base, I don't think that it would ultimately succeed, because I think it's too big of a bullet to bite. I think it would actually significantly undermine the plausibility of utilitarianism as a normative theory. The third strategy, the strategy I like, is to say that, well, everyday moral behavior doesn't contribute directly to maximizing happiness. It provides a necessary backdrop for achieving and maintaining your happiness set point. So the story would go like this. Sure, our happiness is stable across our lifespan. That's true, but happiness is stable across our lifespan because most people behave morally most of the time. If they fail to do so, you would just have so many negative experiences that those dips in your happiness would never have a time to abate, like ripples in a pond. You would just not have enough time to recover from these kinds of negative interactions for your happiness to be restored back to baseline. There's a clear problem with this. It's not clear how you would even test it, or I'm not even sure that it's testable. But I do think it's a plausible story. It's a good place to begin as far as reconciling the normative theory with what is empirically known about happiness. And of course, I don't think that solves all of the counterintuitive implications associated with utilitarianism, but I think it's a good step in the right direction. I also want to point out, it's not on the handout, but a lot of normative theories are in just as precarious of a position as utilitarianism is. If you attempt to tease them out, a lot of them also have these kinds of counterintuitive implications. So my point is not to pick on or to suggest that utilitarianism is somehow more vulnerable to these kinds of things than other normative theories. And I think that's about it. I think that's all that I had to say, but I will open it up for questions, comments, concerns, discussions from you guys. Yeah.
Can you put utilitarianism in kind of a historical perspective? Because it seems to me happiness is a very superficial good, okay? And in history and in other cultures, there are many, many other goods, many other positive things. Happiness, well, who's against happiness? But that kind of emphasizes the superficiality. So can you kind of give us a historical perspective on utilitarianism?
Well, utilitarianism emerged in with Jeremy Bentham. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Jeremy Bentham. So, but it's very much historically connected to the idea that we are the ones that are in charge, that we can in fact take charge of our emotional or our cognitive states. Does that make sense?
Making perfect sense.
Yeah, so, and I recognize, because we're both from anthropology, that that's not always the case. And I do recognize that there have been different attitudes and valuations cross-culturally towards happiness and the worth pursuing it and how important individual happiness is versus collective happiness. So if we wanted a good cross-cultural perspective in a historical sense, I think it would be difficult to make those kinds of generalizations about happiness, just because there is so much variation in attitudes towards happiness, its achievability, our agency in pursuing it, things of that nature. But it's a great question.
Just follow. My take on it is that the rise of utilitarianism coincided with Europeans' discovery of cultural diversity, i.e. colonialism.
Colonialism, yeah. Wait, you had I saw,
Yeah.
what's your name?
Hosher, AJ.
Hosher, and then I saw your question, and you are? Back there, you with your hand up right now. What's your name?
Gerald.
Gerald? Okay, so Hosher, Gerald, and then who had their hand up over
Antonio.
here? Okay, Antonio. Hosher, Gerald, Antonio.
So, with this theory, you're kind of assuming that moral actions are decided. Moral actions are justified by whether or not they make people happy, right? So now we're saying that happiness is right and then suffering is wrong, right?
Yeah.
Or sadness is wrong. that doesn't seem, I mean, like, happiness sometimes doesn't really mean that it's always right. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, I think what I'm thinking about here is I mean, is utilitarianism like the only theory? Or I mean, there's other theories, of
Yeah.
course, but how do you justify whether or not to use each theory in certain situations? Because they have like their different definitions of happiness and right and moral.
Well, speaking for myself, I don't. I'm kind of a committed utilitarian, but that means I have to bite some big bullets.
Mhm.
So one example is like Coliseum fights. It seems like utilitarianism, provided that the audience got enough happiness from watching a battle between two gladiators, it seems like utilitarianism would sanction that as moral behavior. And we would normally want to say that that's not the case. We would want to say that it's wrong to have two people fight to the death. Because, yeah. It's something that's wrong. We wouldn't want to sanction that, at least intuitively. So if you want to be a utilitarian, at least my simple answer is that might be a bullet that you have to bite. Another example is transplant case. So transplant is a real thorn in the side of simple utilitarian renderings. The idea of transplant is you're a doctor, right? And a patient comes in and the patient has a minor problem. We can describe the minor health problem in a variety of ways. You can fill in that blank for yourself, but the idea is, as a doctor, you know that this individual is a match for 5 other patients. And if you were to kill this patient, you would be able to take his organs, because he's an organ donor, use those organs and perform organ transplants and save 5 lives at the cost of 1. It appears like the consequences in transplant are identical to the consequences of the trolley problem, simply in terms of the net number of lives that are saved. But most people, even those who are like, pull the lever in trolley, say that transplant is impermissible. And there's a lot of stories that they give about why that is, but you can just stipulate. Like, for example, they'll say, well, if you do that, you undermine trust in doctors. And then you just stipulate, no, nobody's ever going to find out. This individual doesn't have family members. You can stipulate the consequences from there. I address that problem by biting that bullet. Yeah, and if you're ever in those exact epistemic circumstances and you're a doctor, do it. But you're never in those epistemic circumstances as a doctor in the real world, so you're fine.
I think I would actually, for that argument, I would say that the doctor is sort of like killing the patient, right? But the train, however, is inevitable. It's gonna kill someone anyway. But with the doctor, however, they have that choice still whether to kill the patient or not.
Well, the disease is going to kill the 5 patients either way. I mean, if you do nothing, the disease will kill the 5 patients. The only hope of saving a life is to take action,
Oh, okay.
which
What
ends
he's
up
saying,
costing.
I think has to do with the act of killing.
Yeah.
What that does to the other individual.
Yeah, usually they zero in on the difference between killing and letting die, and assert that the difference between actively killing somebody is morally different from the act of merely allowing them to die. But there are lots of counterexamples to that problem as well. But I think you make a great point. There are counterintuitive implications that utilitarianism has. There are lots of settings where we just don't think that it gives the answer we'd like it to give us. And some of those cases, you just have to bite the bullet. Sometimes you can get out of it by making the explanations more complex. Sometimes these are just kind of like ad hoc strategies, I feel. But I do think that there are complex renderings of utilitarianism that solve some of the problems you're concerned about. Gerald.
I was curious, in the study, what methods are used to determine the happiness levels of individuals, how reliable are those methods?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So one of the largest sources for this project used a huge sampling of individuals, and it asked them questions about their subjective well-being. I'd love to give you more specific information, but the details actually escape me. But the idea was they had a large sample size. It was like a population level sample, and they asked them questions about their fulfillment and things of that nature. And what they saw is that across time, their subjective ratings of happiness remained relatively constant. And this has been replicated throughout the psychological literature as well. Does that answer your question? I wish I could give you more specific information, but that's the best that I can do off the top of my head. And all right. It looks like you're thinking. I'll come back to you if you want to elaborate.
Oh, that's good that he's thinking.
And Tony,
Actually, picking up on his question, actually, about how to measure these issues. Actually, I was reading the Spanish newspaper, and they had a ranking of countries where happiness is more prevalent. At the top of the list, I was wondering, is that even possible? What are the categories to create such a even searching for that level of happiness? What kind of method are they using to measure that? Anyway, so at the top of the list was Denmark, Sweden was nearby, the United States was well represented too. But then, you you look at the different countries and what made that happiness. In Denmark, what made happiness in Denmark would be not really that much of a pleasure here. So I was wondering, again, can we really measure happiness as a standard? Like, or how do you get to that?
so I think you make a great point. So I would actually like to talk for a minute about the happiness rankings that you're referencing. One of the discrepancies is that it seems like individuals, when we look solely at individuals, it seems like individuals remain kind of stable. But when we look at the big picture, it looks like countries on aggregate can sometimes change. And there's not a good explanation for why that is in a lot of cases. So understanding the difference between these kinds of rankings where we position countries or look at the change in happiness at the nation level is different than looking at the change of countries or the change of the happiness in individuals. And I don't know how to reconcile those. I'm not even familiar with the methods they use to create the rankings of countries. But it is something that seems to be unusual in the literature. But I also want to address the other point that you made, which I think is a good point. What is happiness for people in Denmark is not the same as what is happiness for people in Spain. And what's happiness in Spain is not necessarily identical to what's happy in Brazil. But I don't think that's a problem, because what's being measured or what we're talking about is subjective well-being, your own assessment of how it is you're doing. So if we ask people in Denmark, are you happy? And they say, 6, I'm 6% happy, or I'm on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm a 6. They're of course responding to their cultural background beliefs and the culture that they're a part of. But it doesn't seem to me that that's necessarily a problem if what is 6 in Denmark is a different set of circumstances than what is 6 in Spain, right? Because we can just say, well, different kinds of circumstances, different cultural milieus might give us a different answer about what it is we ought to do. That doesn't really tell us that we can't use that as a metric for gauging what actions there should be. Does that make sense? It just means they might be different in Denmark and different in Brazil based on how people understand happiness.
I want you to make reference to the United States.
Yeah, or the United
comparing
States,
things.
right?
Well, there was another, you can see I read a lot newspapers. So I was reading the other day the New York Times saying that there is a record of people, a number of hours that people don't take here in this country for vacations. It's like every year I have been increasing the days and hours that people don't take their vacations. So, I mean, I was thinking like connecting that to Denmark, people take their vacations there. Actually, it's a contributor to their cultural level, sense of happiness and well-being. So I was thinking, why making this country for people to stay at work instead of taking vacation or days off?
But here, in many companies that do that, there's a financial incentive. They can cash out on those unused days off.
Oh, that definitely.
And I don't know if that's the same in European countries.
I don't know.
A lot of those leaves in European countries are mandatory. You have to take the time.
Yeah, well, yes, that's true.
So yeah, that was a great question, a great point though. I saw you, did you have your hand up?
I did. I was thinking about the trolley problem and the outcome here. And I'm thinking that not everyone would choose to let 4 people live, because I think the conceptualization here, looking at it, we really are talking about individual morality versus societal morality. And I think the individual clearly is relative and personal. And as you're talking about looking at the happiness across the different countries, I mean, clearly we respect the significance of the findings of research with statistically appropriate procedures. But then if you break it down to the individual person, I guess the question really becomes, what is the right answer? Is the right answer pulling the lever? Does it come down to individualism? That's what I think I want to ask and comment on.
Oh, well, my answer is you should pull the lever. And that's like this kind of simplest story that utilitarianism would tell. But yeah, there's a difference between what we, kind of our consensus
Yeah.
in our culture about what we could do. It's possible that could be different from what it is that, from the normative fact about what it is we ought to do. At the beginning, I'm not sure if you came in later.
Yeah.
At the beginning, I talked about the distinction between descriptive and normative claims, right? A descriptive claim is people are sexist. A normative claim is people should not be sexist, right? And so even if we were to look at the culture and find people don't believe this, people don't think they should pull the lever, it doesn't really address the normative claim that they ought to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
But yeah, the point is well taken, and I agree with you. I think that there are different cultural attitudes and sentiments that people could have.
And even within the culture.
Right, even within the even within this table, not
Yes,
everybody thought they should
exactly.
pull the lever.
Yes,
May.
so what I was gonna say is, utilitarianism presumes that happiness is a real thing.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it even is, especially since you might think you're happy.
Ooh, skepticism.
I think I'm happy. Okay, I thought I was happy 10 years ago at certain times, and I wasn't really. And I think our self-knowledge is such an unreliable thing. I don't think that you can go by self-reporting, and then there's no objective way to determine it otherwise.
So I'm not sure how to really address skepticism about the existence of happiness. I agree with you 100% that we oftentimes just don't have a lot of information about our internal workings. We don't even always have perfect access to our own internal states. But off the top of my head, and I will probably give you a much better answer later on, but off the top of my head, it seems that if you ask me if I'm happy, the very best I can do is just inspect my current condition and give you a number. I might be wrong. I mean, if there is such a thing, if there exists such an objective fact of the matter about whether or not I'm happy, it's possible that because my mind is opaque to me, I don't have perfect access to that answer. But it seems like the best that I can do is just to look inside and be like, yeah, I feel like I'm like an 8 today, May. And that seems to be the very best I can do, and it seems to be a reasonable kind of method to use, even if there is an objective fact of the matter and we're sometimes mistaken. Right? Really, the best that the literature can do is just to track subjective well-being. Does that make sense? And
it makes a lot of sense.
But yeah, I agree with
you. And you
yeah.
said why.
I agree with you 100% that we oftentimes don't have perfect access to our internal states. Layla, and then Bruce, and then Eric.
I sort of want to springboard off of that, and you know I'm not a utilitarian.
I know you're not, dear. That's okay. I forgive you.
I love you anyway. See, but the problem I have with explanations of that nature that, well, you know, I can reasonably say I'm an 8 today, that's fine if that's not being used to justify a universal moral claim of utilitarianism, right? If the universal moral claim is that, well, a moral decision is good just in case it maximizes happiness, but that happiness that we're using to justify said moral decision is a guess at best, I don't see how reliable that justification is.
So yeah, I think I know where you're going, and I think I appreciate your position. I have a lot of sympathy for your position, because we can think of cross-culturally, particularly for women, situations that we think they're in circumstances that really don't appear to necessarily be in their best interest. We want to say, objectively, the things that are going on for you is not in your best interest. But they subjectively say, well, I'm happy and this is what I believe and this is how I want to live my life. How do we deal with those kinds of situations when we're attempting to decide moral permissibility? Is that something like what you were thinking?
Well, I think the way out of it for utilitarians is to say something just like that, well, does it really matter whether we have a fact of the matter? Fact of it. You know, you get my point. That the point is that if there were a way to measure happiness, and if there were a way, you know, regardless of what that amounts to be, that as long as it's maximized cross-culturally, then that's what's...
Yeah, so you've anticipated what my response is going to be. Subjective well-being is certainly one aspect of well-being, right? It's certainly one aspect, and it is the aspect that we were interested in for purposes of this question. But when we broaden our scope beyond our own immediate sort of moral habitat, the kinds of situations we encounter every day, we might want to open our considerations to other kinds of well-being that are not explicitly subjective assessment. I can't even pretend to begin to know how to do that in any sort of way that's coherent or systematizable, if that's a word. I'm not sure how I would begin to approach that, except to kind of just appeal to intuitions. I don't know how it would be quantified. Those other kinds of more abstract or nebulous kinds of well-being, or even just concrete things like,
My worry is
yeah.
that it's a very easy road into relativism about morality. Because if that's the case, then, you know, take your example of women in situations where, you know, they would say that they're happy, but you can see from the outset that, well, this doesn't really seem to be the correct, right?
I think there is a way we err in the opposite side, though. I think a lot of the times, though, when we discount the importance of subjective well-being, there's a tendency to come and look at people who are very different from us, who have attitudes or values that seem strange to them, But they say, well, these work for us. This is what we do. This is who we are. This is our identity. So I think that, well, I agree with you. There is a way that you can err in the direction that you're suggesting. I think it has to be very, very careful, lest we just trample all over kind of the cultural sovereignty or the cultural attitudes of other groups of people without reason, right? Because I think our first impulse is often when we see people who are different from us, who don't share our beliefs, is to dismiss them as just kind of being wrong about what kind of life is fulfilling. So if we were going to take that route, I would advise a lot of reflection on whether or not somebody is actually having their best interests compromised, or if they just have a very different way of being in the world. Does that answer your question? Okay, awesome. Bruce?
I just have two comments. One's about Trolley.
Okay.
And I
Oh,
wanted
no.
to point out that,
This is where I have to go to my office.
okay,
Sure, Layla.
Very well timed. I'm so
Go
sorry.
to your office hours, Layla.
I'm going to come to your office and tell you what I was in Trolley, I want to point out that actually the person who throws the lever is killing the one on the one track. And so it's like Transplant in that respect. It was actually produced, Trolley, in order to defeat the view that the killing, letting die distinction is morally relevant. That's why Judith Thompson gave that, really, because Philippa Foot defended that other view earlier. That's just a comment historically, and what's really happening, I think, in Trolley is somebody's getting killed. You kill them if you throw the lever. The other thing is about happiness. There are objective.
Oh, no, I was just going to say something about Trolley.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with you about Trolley. When I was talking about Transplant, the idea of the parallel between Trolley and Transplant is in the Trolley case, if you allow the trolley to proceed down its original course, you're allowing the 5 people on the track to die. Whereas if you pull the lever, you're killing the one. In Transplant, you're allowing the 5 people with the disease to die, as opposed to killing the one to organ harvest them. So yeah, I agree with you. Thank you for making that point.
About happiness, there are objective conceptions and sort of ideal conceptions of happiness that aren't so subjective as the one you're working at. One objective conception says that you're happy insofar as the most important things in your life are going well, or the most important things in your life is taken to be an objective notion rather subjective. And there are kind of intermediate ones that are ideal observer theories that say, well, it's not what you gives you pleasure, it's what competent judges get pleasure from or prefer. And competent judges are defined in terms of people who've had experience of a wide variety of kinds of activities or situations and the like. So that's kind of subjective, but relative to the ideal observers.
So yeah, Bruce is making a great point. At the beginning of the talk, remember how I talked about we have subspecies of happiness and all of that good stuff? There are subspecies of utilitarianism that kind of take a different attitude. We can look at preference satisfaction, which is like what Bruce is talking about, where the things that are most important to you are going well. Or we could consider our perspective from, or our happiness from the perspective of like a third-party ideal observer. These are ways that we can do it. It certainly can be done. And I agree that what I'm talking about has different implications for different styles or subspecies of utilitarianism. But for the sake of the talk, there just wasn't enough time to trace out all the different implications. But if you want to read my paper, Bruce, there you go. You have a compelling reason to read my paper and give me feedback.
Just give me, bump my happiness up a little.
But it will do wonders for mine. You need to promote utility, Bruce.
So on balance, it's good.
Yeah, exactly. On balance, it's good. All right. Eric, did you still have something that you wanted to say? And then
This is just a speculation. So
in 2 minutes.
when people rate their subjective well-being, there's something comparative there. but there may be ignorance of what they're comparing against. So you could be rating your subjective well-being as compared to what you think is the best that's possible for you realistically. And the best that's possible for you realistically, like May. May says, 10 years ago I thought I was happy, but she didn't realize the joys of marrying a philosopher. And so maybe her idea of the ceiling, where she rated herself, I don't know, 7 out of 10, but her idea of the ceiling
That's the point I was getting
low.
at, I think, but I have a different point, but you probably want to get going, right?
Well, I mean, and then Layla was raising maybe a similar issue, or you and Layla were talking about a similar issue, that if your possibilities are socially limited, you might say, hey, I'm doing pretty well in comparison to what you're taking the ceiling to be, but that ceiling might be low in respect of where it maybe ought to be.
That's yeah, I think you're making a point that I don't really have a good answer to, if I understand your point correctly. So if I understand your point correctly, you're suggesting that when I'm rating my happiness at different times throughout my life, I'm comparing it based on some other conception or some other idea that I have of what the happiness ceiling consists of, and that might change? Is that?
Well, I was actually thinking of it more of a cross-individual than within.
Okay, so my happiness ceiling is different from your happiness ceiling.
Well,
Would that be the idea?
Well, I was actually thinking kind of cross-culturally more than within an individual or within two people in very similar circumstances. They just might have different ideas of what's possible for them.
Either way, I think that's a great point. I don't know how we could possibly control for that. I think it's a legitimate question to address in my paper. So I will make sure that I address that question.
Yes.
It's 1:30. Do you guys want to keep going? Keep having this conversation? Awesome. Okay, sir, I don't know your name.
I'm Vince.
Vince?
Yes.
Awesome.
So this is kind of an observation followed by a question. As I heard your presentation, it seems to me there's kind of a tension going on between two different parts about the happiness set point. On the one hand, you kind of depend pretty heavily on the idea that the set point is stable, almost to the point of suggesting that it can't be changed. On the other hand, you have a fair number of issues from observations in psychology about especially kind of life-changing circumstances that can, in fact, shift the set point.
Right.
So that suggests that there's a better way to say it. There's both a strong and a weak version of your set point claim. One is that it can't change under the normal kinds of things that we like to fantasize about, the job, the raise, the vacation, but that it can change in other kinds of ways. And so long as it can change at all, then I guess I kind of think that a utilitarian would have a pretty good response. That we can measure this, we can change it, we can improve it in lots of kinds of ways. We just have been doing it badly, but you folks in the wrong place.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. You can certainly say that. In fact, I think that one of the good things about this research is that it makes it a lot easier to sort of cash utilitarianism out as far as what kinds of things socially can we do in order to promote happiness. And that speaks to your point that maybe we've just been doing things wrong. Maybe we're not pursuing the right kinds of things or things of that nature. And I agree with you. It's not clear why prolonged periods of unemployment will downshift our happiness and have such long-term significant impacts on our subjective well-being, but having a vacation doesn't have a significant sustained positive effect. There are theories about why that is, but it's certainly possible, given what we know, that we could just say that we're doing it wrong. But I think that if we have to say we're doing it so wrong that most of our common sense moral beliefs about what to do on a day-to-day basis is just sort of mistaken or off base, then I think that's a problem. I think we're in trouble if our normative theory tells us that most of what we believe to be morally true is just far from the mark. So we can say, yeah, we're doing it wrong, but I don't think we can say we're doing it totally wrong. That seems that that was my strategy too, just kind of biting the bullet. Like it just doesn't underwrite our common sense moral beliefs.
This follows up on that, and what I'm thinking again, it goes back to this whole conception and perception of happiness. So when you look at utopian societies, or what people think are utopian societies, everybody thinks they're happy, but it's this sort of boring, low-level happiness, and nobody knows that there is a greater happiness possible, including all of us. There may be this really great happiness possible that we can't imagine. And so you might have to be unhappy for a little while in order to get to there. You might have to sacrifice and work hard, and we don't know and this is for potential happiness. We don't know what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you. Nothing that I've said precludes that as a possibility. It's entirely possible that there are, in fact, circumstances or things that we could do that would bring our happiness up here, and we just don't know about them. Nothing that I say precludes that, and I think it's a great question. I think it's a great question that we could examine in the future. Catherine, I saw you had your hand up, and then, I'm sorry, with Janelle, and then I saw your hand again.
Oh, Dolores.
Dolores. Catherine, Janelle, Dolores.
I just wanted to point out that the kind of problem that Eric and May were raising before, there's a term for that. It's called adaptive preferences, the Martha Nussbaum works on, right? And so the idea is that she did these experiments, and widows in India who have such poor health, they rated their happiness higher than men in India who were actually somewhat taken care of in terms of their physical well-being. And the idea was that, look, women adapt their preferences or their expected utility based on their restricted options, right? So they just don't expect to be healthy and be taken care of, right? And so they adjust their preferences. And so that is a kind of problem that she raises for utilitarianism. Okay. That measuring utility over subjective utility is just not going to do a good job measuring across societies and even across someone's lifespan.
Yeah.
And so that's why she takes up this capability.
That's great. I made a note of it because I want to find that research. That sounds awesome. That sounds like that will really enrich the project. Thank you, Catherine. You're so insightful. Janelle.
Hi. So you were mentioning earlier that a vacation, like a positive type of moment, wouldn't be a long-term effect on the upswing of happiness, but losing a job would be more permanent. And I'm wondering if there are psychologically more positive events in our life that would, such as accomplishing graduating from university or accomplishing certifications in things or marrying your spouse, those sorts of things, if that would raise the bar. And if it's more of a psyche thing in terms of how it affects our psyche short or long term.
So that's a wonderful question. I think that's a great question. According to the research that I have read, the answer is no. It's much easier to downshift your subjective well-being than to upshift it. So even things like graduation, well, certainly it can have a bigger impact on your temporary assessment of subjective well-being. And for some individuals, that impact will be sustained. In other words, it drops more slowly. It'll be sustained for a longer period of time. At least according to the research that I've read thus far on the project, it does appear to be the case that even with these positive life events, it does regress to baseline. Marriage is actually interesting. I read a piece that just examines divorce and marriage, and actually getting married can temporarily drop your subjective well-being because because the idea is that the process of planning a wedding and going through the wedding and things like that can actually have a detrimental effect just because of all of the stress that you experience related to that. So as far as long-term though, it does appear like it eventually regresses to baseline, at least based on the articles, the research that I've read.
Interesting.
It is interesting. It's also weird. It's kind of, it's counterintuitive, I think. Dolores.
Yeah, I was just going to say, before she spoke about, she's gone about adaptive preferences, that the whole concept of subjective valuation of happiness seems really, it's time bound, that one can't know where one will be. And so the level of subjectivity will change over a period of time. And you're saying that it will reset. But I guess my point is that it seems like one's evaluation at a certain time is really related to the time that they're in their lives, and that can be.
Yeah, I think that the contextual assessment of our happiness, our understanding of the ceiling, is going to be an interesting aspect to explore further in this project. But yeah, I agree. I think it's going to create an interesting wrinkle for this project that I have to explore more fully.
Can you take this last question?
Yeah, I know your name. I know it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's on the tip of my tongue. It starts with an H?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, just give it to me. I'm so sorry. Hasher?
Hasher.
Hasher.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry, Hasher.
No, it's fine. So, we've been talking about the baseline of happiness and how stress levels can reduce your happiness, or graduating can have temporary effect, maybe even raise it and then start to simmer down. So I'm thinking, is happiness kind of like a drug? Because if that's what we're talking about here, then shouldn't we just stay away from that happiness?
Just say no to happiness.
Wasn't that a Beatles song, Happiness is a Good Drug? Or
Born gun.
Born Gun,
Yeah.
that's it.
Hasher, I do not even know how to begin to answer that question as to the extent to which happiness resembles a drug. So we might tease it apart in several different dimensions. We might say, well, biochemically, is it similar to the kinds of things we see in the brain or in the body that are associated with drug use? And it occurs to me, just off the top of my head, that in the biochemical dimension, it would certainly be very similar to a drug. But then the question is, for purposes of moral evaluation, is it analogous to a drug because it produces the same kinds of consequences? I think I might be running the risk of begging the question if I ask that, but I don't know. Like I said, I don't even know how to begin to dismantle that question to start answering it in the few minutes that
You just
we
need
have.
more medication, is that
Yeah, it's a good question.
More antidepressants?
Drugs and plastic surgery, that's.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Thank you guys.